You ever have a moment where something you thought you knew suddenly shifts, like your heart just catches a truth your mind wasn't ready for? That happened to me. And what I saw changed everything. There comes a time in every person's life, and this I know for sure, when the voice you've allowed to speak over your soul for years begins to falter. It stumbles not because it is wrong all the time, but because something inside of you is finally strong enough to challenge it. When I speak to myself this way, that phrase has lingered with me for years. I have whispered it on long walks alone, shouted it inside my journal pages, and cried it in silence. That voice, the one that echoes the stories we've been told, the histories we inherited without question, the assumptions we carry as if they are facts. It's not our voice. Not really. It is our conditioning, our fear, our generational inheritance. And at some point, for those who are willing to do the work, that voice meets the truth. I remember sitting in front of a screen, much like any other day. The world was noisy, as it always is, and somewhere in the sea of news reports and social media scrolls, a headline jumped out: Palestinians launch terror attacks. Now I've lived long enough and talked to enough people to know that headlines are designed to provoke. But this headline didn't just provoke. It settled somewhere uncomfortable inside me, not because I had an informed perspective at the time, but because it felt too easy, too flat, too convenient. And when something is that convenient, it usually means someone else's complexity is being erased. So I did what I always do when something won't sit right. I got still. I asked myself questions. I asked, why do I believe what I believe? I asked, who taught me to think this way? I asked, what stories have I never heard because someone decided they weren't worth telling? That's where the inner dialogue began to shift, not in defiance, not in rebellion, but in deep curiosity, because what we repeat in our minds is often what we've absorbed without knowing it. I realized that the voice in my head wasn't mine, not the true rooted soul-deep voice. It was the echo of a system, a media landscape, a culture shaped by decades of one-sided storytelling. I had to ask myself, if the only time I ever hear about a people is when they're being accused, criminalized, dehumanized, what chance do I have of seeing them clearly? And more importantly, what chance do they have of being seen? I began to notice the language I used when I spoke to myself about this issue, or more accurately, avoided speaking to myself. I realized that silence can be its own kind of speech. I had grown silent about the Palestinian people because the only script I was given came with fear, judgment, and finality. The world had already decided who they were, and when the world decides, we often follow, not because we are unkind, but because we're busy, distracted, overwhelmed. We trust the loudest voice in the room, but that voice in the room is not the voice within. And when I finally turned down the volume of everything around me, I began to hear the still, small voice that asked, "What do you know for sure, Oprah? What do you know when you remove the slogans, the politics, the fear?" I didn't know much, but I knew that if someone calls out in pain, my first instinct should be to listen, not to judge, not to label, just to listen. So I started listening. I listened to stories I had never heard before. Not from pundits or politicians, but from mothers and fathers, teachers, doctors, artists, and children. I watched videos that didn't make the nightly news. I read poetry and testimonies from people living in Gaza and the West Bank. I let their words, their images, their lives speak to me, not about war but about love, about loss, about being human. And here's what happened. The voice in my head changed. It softened. It questioned itself, and then it became quiet enough for a new voice to speak. A voice that said, "You cannot call someone a monster until you have looked them in the eye, until you have heard them sing lullabies to their children, until you've seen them protect their elders, until you've watched them pray." This wasn't about politics anymore. It was about truth, about seeing people in full color, instead of in shadows, about asking, What if everything I believed was only a fraction of the story? That's when the mirror appeared, not a mirror on the wall, but a mirror inside, and I saw myself asking the world to see me, a black woman in America, beyond stereotype, beyond caricature, beyond the names history has tried to force onto my skin. I saw myself, and I saw them, and I could no longer ignore that the voice I used to speak to myself was the same voice used to justify dismissing others. That voice had to change. That inner dialogue had to grow up. It had to make room for a more honest conversation. Words are powerful. They build worlds. They create enemies. They protect some and endanger others. In all my years of interviewing, of listening, of witnessing people speak their truths across every continent, the one thing I have learned is this: labels are not just words. They are weapons. They are shelters. They are prisons. And when the world chooses a label, especially one as charged, as final, as terrorist, we all become a little less curious, a little less human, because that word doesn't ask questions. It doesn't leave room for context. It declares. It condemns. When I heard the word used again and again in reference to Palestinians, terrorist, militant, radical, I began to notice the ease with which it was said. It rolled off tongues without tremble, without hesitation. It came from newscasters, politicians, academics, and even people at dinner tables, and each time it was said, something tightened in my chest, not because I fully understood what was being said, but because I began to realize what wasn't being said. The word terrorist flattens a person. It collapses an entire life, history, grief and love story into one unredeemable thing. It says this person is not worth understanding. This person is not worthy of compassion. This person cannot be part of your community of care. And yet I couldn't reconcile that with what I saw, not in the headlines, but in the quiet corners of the internet, in shaky videos filmed from phones, in testimony shared in poetry and pain. What I saw were faces, families, children holding on to bread in bombed-out kitchens, grandmothers praying through tears, fathers trying to explain to their sons why a wall divided their home, and I found myself staring at the screen, asking how do we go from this heartbreak, this resilience, to the word terrorist? How do we let that word erase everything else? And more importantly, who gets to decide when that word is used, and when it is not? Because I've seen violent acts committed by people in suits and ties, behind desks, under the guise of democracy. I've seen suffering legitimized and justified depending on who the victims were, and who held the power, and never once did I hear those people called terrorists. Never once did I hear their names attached to such finality. Instead, we use words like collateral damage, defensive action, national security. It is the language of comfort, the language that lets us sleep at night. But when I looked at the lives of ordinary Palestinians, I didn't see anything that resembled the label they had been forced to wear. What I saw were people who had known loss longer than they'd known safety, people who planted olive trees not just for fruit, but for hope, people who held keys to homes that no longer existed, not out of denial, but out of dignity, people who taught their children math, even when the school had been shelled. I saw strength, I saw resistance, but I also saw joy, and art, and beauty that refused to die, and I had to ask myself, what does it mean that we never see this side, that their weddings are not on our screens, but their funerals are, that their poetry is not translated, but their pain is politicized? It made me realize how easily we let ourselves live inside curated narratives, how easily we trust the frame someone else gives us, without checking who is holding the camera. When the label terrorist is placed upon a people, it gives the rest of the world permission to stop seeing, to stop caring, and that is the most dangerous thing of all, the death of empathy. I thought back to the many stories I've heard from black men and women who have been labeled, misnamed, reduced to one moment or one mistake. I thought of all the mothers I've sat with, who told me about the fear their children carry, simply for existing in a world that saw them first as threat, and last as human. And I thought, if we know how wrong it is when it's done to us, how can we not see when it's being done to someone else? The discrepancy between label and reality is not just a media problem, it is a soul problem. It means we've become comfortable with half-truths, and with the silence that follows. It means we've accepted that some people's stories will never be told fully, because it serves a narrative to keep them half-formed. It keeps power undisturbed. And I've spent my life disturbing comfort zones, mine included. When I heard Palestinians being called terrorists, I believed it at first, not because I had proof, but because I had no reason to question what I was told. That's what privilege does. It makes you believe that the story you're being given is the whole story. It makes you forget to ask, whose voice is missing? But when I saw the lived reality, not curated, not filtered, not captioned for political convenience, I understood how deeply that label betrayed what was really happening. These were not people defined by violence. They were people defined by survival, by enduring, by loving in a world that had forgotten them. And love, I've learned, is the most radical thing you can do in the face of erasure. It is the loudest truth. When the world tries to silence you, there is something that happens when you see something with your own eyes that contradicts everything you've been taught to believe. It is not a loud moment, it's not a dramatic reckoning, it is quiet, it's subtle, it's the kind of moment that sneaks up on your spirit and rearranges the furniture inside your soul without asking permission. That's what witnessing does, not watching from a distance, not analyzing from a place of comfort, but truly witnessing, being present with someone's truth, letting their story enter your body, unfiltered, unrehearsed, unapproved by any system. That is where change begins. When I first began looking more deeply into the lives of Palestinians, not through the lens of politics or news cycles, but through the lens of personal experience, I didn't know I was walking towards something that would shift the ground beneath my feet. I thought I was doing research, I thought I was seeking clarity, but what I was really doing was allowing myself to be seen by their pain, and to see them fully in return. What I encountered wasn't just a humanitarian crisis, it wasn't just injustice. What I saw was faith, a kind of faith I couldn't explain away, a devotion, a stillness in suffering, a presence in grief that seemed to move in a different rhythm than what I was used to. I saw families praying together minutes after their homes were turned to dust. I saw children who could name every sound of every bomb but still played soccer with whatever they could find. I saw women leading their communities in strength, carrying both trauma and tenderness like they were born to do both. I saw men whose eyes had seen war but whose hearts still softened when they recited words from the Quran. I saw people rooted in their belief not because it was easy, but because it was the only thing that made sense in a world that had made so little sense around them. And there I was, watching it all, a woman who had spent decades asking others to tell their truth, suddenly humbled by the truth of others that I had never thought to ask about. I kept thinking to myself, how have I not seen this before? Not just the images, not just the suffering, but the spirit, the deep, unshakable spirit that held their lives together. I saw Islam not as a word on the news, not as a religion of rules or rituals, but as a lived practice of grace, submission and trust in the divine amidst chaos. I saw Islam not through the lens of fear, but through the lens of love, and not romantic love, but a love of God that was whole, unwavering, intimate. And in that witnessing, something opened in me. It wasn't a conversion of intellect. It wasn't a debate won. It wasn't someone preaching to me. It was spirit recognizing spirit. It was heart meeting heart. It was soul remembering something it had always known but had never been taught. I began to understand something I had only ever heard in pieces, that submission to God is not weakness, it is not passivity, it is not resignation, it is the boldest act of trust in a world that will betray you. It is the loudest kind of peace you can choose when the world is screaming violence. I saw that in the people I met, in the footage I watched, in the voices I listened to through stories and songs. I had always thought of awakening as a mountaintop experience, dramatic, earth-shattering. But sometimes awakening is sitting still with someone else's pain long enough to hear God speak through it. Sometimes awakening is realizing that everything you believed about the world was built on someone else's silence. Sometimes it is simply standing in awe of someone's devotion, and realizing that it is more honest, more grounded, and more whole than anything you've ever been taught to fear. What I saw in Palestine, and more importantly what I felt, was a kind of faith that I had never encountered in such concentration, a faith that wrapped around every conversation, every tear, every moment of laughter, even in mourning. It was not performative, it was not dogmatic, it was lived, it was embodied, it was breathed, it was what allowed people to stay human when everything around them said they shouldn't be, and in that I felt something shift inside me. There was one moment that I will never forget. A man stood in the rubble of what had once been his home. His hands were dusty, his clothes torn, and as the camera caught him standing still, he looked up and said, "Alhamdulillah, praise be to God." Not in anger, not in sarcasm, but in peace. And in that moment I felt something inside me fall silent. That silence was not empty, it was full of awe, full of surrender, full of a reverence that I had never known before. That was the moment I realized that witnessing is not passive, it is not just observing, it is being changed. It is allowing someone else's truth to move you from where you've been to where your soul is ready to go. And for me, witnessing the reality of Palestinian lives, not through the voices that had always narrated their story for them, but through their own words, their own faith, their own presence, was the beginning of a spiritual unfolding I never expected. Empathy is not a soft word. It's not the kind of thing you sprinkle into a conversation to sound kind or thoughtful. Empathy, true, embodied empathy, is radical, it is disruptive. It demands that you put down everything you think you know and step into the world of someone else, not to observe, not to fix, but to feel. And that is hard, because feeling costs us something. It costs us comfort, it costs us certainty, it costs us the illusion that our version of the world is the only one that matters. What I have learned, especially in the sacred space of sitting across from people and asking them to tell me their story, is that empathy is the only bridge that leads to truth. Without it we are just gathering information to defend our views, but with it we begin to see, not from a place of intellect, but from the heart, and the heart, when it's awake, tells the truth in a way no argument ever can. When I first started listening to the voices of Palestinian families, really listening, not scanning headlines, not reading statements from governments, but sitting with their stories, I found myself overwhelmed, not by politics, not by complexity, but by emotion. These were not people asking to be agreed with, they were asking to be seen. And when someone asks you to see them, not as a statistic, not as a problem, not as a symbol, but as a living, breathing soul with dreams and fears, you have two choices. You can lean in, or you can turn away. Empathy made me lean in. There was a mother I saw speaking into a camera, holding the photograph of her child. Her voice didn't tremble the way I thought it would. It was strong, not because she wasn't broken, but because she had no time to be. Her home was gone, her son had died, but she still had to wake up and make tea the next day, still had to care for the other children, still had to survive. And she spoke with a calm that shook me, not a numbness, but a clarity. She said, "We are not numbers, we are people, and our love is not less than yours." That sentence wrapped around my soul and stayed there. I realized in that moment that empathy is not pity. Empathy does not place you above someone, it places you beside them. It asks you to stand there even if your knees tremble, even if your worldview begins to crumble. It says, feel this, not because it's about you, but because truth demands to be felt. And the truth of the Palestinian people, what I saw and heard again and again, was not just in their suffering, but in their unwavering humanity in the face of being erased. I began to understand why empathy is so rare in global conversations, because empathy is dangerous to the status quo. It dismantles the labels, it threatens the narratives that keep certain systems in place. It says, this person you've been told to fear, This person is a mother just like you. This person grieves just like you. This person hopes just like you. And once you've seen someone that way, you can't unsee them. You can't go back to calling them by the name the world gave them to keep them small. That's why so much effort goes into preventing empathy from taking root, because once it does, you start asking questions, you start noticing the gaps in the story, you start wanting justice, not in a theoretical way, but in a personal, grounded, aching way. I remember watching a group of children in a refugee camp drawing pictures. They were smiling, laughing, joking as children do, but when you looked at what they were drawing, it wasn't flowers or sunshine, it was tanks, it was soldiers, it was broken homes, and yet their laughter rang out like church bells in the middle of rubble. It didn't make sense, until it did, until I understood that their joy wasn't the absence of pain, but the resistance to it. It was their way of saying, we are still here, and something about that, about choosing joy when everything else is falling apart, struck me as profoundly spiritual, profoundly human. Empathy made me see that this was not just about one people's struggle, it was about our collective failure to listen, it was about how easy it is to ignore what doesn't affect us directly. And yet I kept thinking, what if we all lived that way? What if we only cared about the people who look like us, believe like us, live where we live? What kind of world would that be? A world where pain has no meaning unless it's our own. That's not the world I want to live in. That's not the world I've spent my life trying to help others awaken from. Empathy gave me access to truths I would have otherwise never known. It cracked something open in me, not just awareness, but connection. And connection, I've found, is the antidote to dehumanization. You cannot dehumanize someone you have taken the time to understand. You cannot ignore someone whose voice echoes inside you when you close your eyes at night. And that's what happened. Their voices stayed with me, their faces, their prayers, their songs, their silences. It became clear to me that empathy wasn't a choice anymore, it was a responsibility, a sacred obligation, because once you've truly seen someone, your soul knows it, and your soul remembers. There's a moment, and maybe you've felt it too, when curiosity becomes something deeper. It doesn't just live in your mind anymore. It settles into your body. It changes the way you walk through the world. That shift, that subtle but irreversible shift, is when truth stops being an idea you're exploring, and starts being a path you are walking. It's the moment when you no longer just want to know. You need to live in alignment with what you've come to understand. That's what conviction feels like. It's not loud, it's not dramatic, it's steady, unshakable. And it begins with curiosity that was honest enough to ask the real questions. I didn't go looking for a transformation, that's the truth. I went looking for understanding, for clarity. I wanted to understand why people spoke with so much passion and pain when they talked about Palestine, why every image, every name, every demolished building stirred something I couldn't name but also couldn't ignore. And I'll be honest, in the beginning, I thought I was just doing the work of a seeker, a journalist, a listener. I thought I was gathering knowledge to form a more informed opinion, but what I didn't know is that truth, when it is real, when it is raw and rooted in lived human experience, does not let you remain neutral. I began with questions. I asked what was happening. I asked why the world was so divided. I asked how generations of people had been made invisible. I asked what resistance meant in the language of survival. And with every question, the answers came not from political commentators or think tank panels, but from the people themselves, through poetry, through pain, through stories passed from mother to daughter, through whispered prayers spoken under rubble, through the dignity in the faces of those who had lost everything and still woke up to live another day. As I listened and learned, something changed. The questions didn't feel like they were about them anymore. They became about me. Who was I in relation to this truth? What would I do with what I had seen? What does it mean to bear witness, and then carry on as if nothing has changed inside you? The more I saw, the less I could pretend I didn't. And that's when I realized, curiosity is the door, but conviction, that is the room you walk into once you've crossed the threshold. And once you're inside, the only thing you can do is live differently. There's a cost to that. Conviction is not comfortable. It asks things of you. It interrupts your normal. It challenges your silence. It makes you rethink the stories you've always believed. And it makes you listen more than you speak. It calls you out when you want to stay safe. And it calls you in when the world tries to turn your gaze away. It doesn't let you forget. And for me it meant understanding that what I had once considered distant, a struggle happening over there, was deeply connected to every truth I have ever stood for: dignity, justice, humanity, voice. The Palestinian people, what I witnessed of their resilience, their faith, their resistance, their unimaginable loss and unshakable love, did not just inform my opinion, they challenged my spirit. They made me ask what kind of world I had been conditioned to accept. They made me ask how I had benefited from certain narratives being left unquestioned, and most of all they made me see that truth, when encountered in its full complexity and power, is not something you admire from afar. It's something that calls you to action, not always in public, not always in protest, but always in presence. That presence for me began to look like a spiritual turning, a leaning into something I had felt circling me quietly for some time. It was as if the more I witnessed the integrity of people who prayed through war, fasted through hunger, and gave thanks even in the absence of shelter, the more I felt something awakening in me. It wasn't just admiration, it was recognition, a soul-level resonance, like I was watching a people move with God in a way I had never seen before. And that movement, that submission, that trust, it touched something in me that had long been dormant. I found myself drawn not only to their stories, but to their source of strength, to the words they repeated in sorrow and celebration, to the way they said Alhamdulillah with full chests and open palms, to the rhythm of prayer, of discipline, of faith that held them like an anchor in the storm. And the more I saw that, the more I wanted to understand it, not for analysis, not for debate, but because my heart kept leaning closer, as if to say, this is where your next question lives. That question was not intellectual, it was spiritual. It asked me, what do you believe in deeply enough that you would still whisper it after everything else is taken away? I had spent my life surrounded by belief, belief in power, belief in healing, belief in truth, but what I saw in Gaza, in the West Bank, in the faces of Palestinian refugees, was belief that didn't require certainty, it only required surrender, a belief that said, even here, even now, God is with us. And for someone like me, who had spent a lifetime asking the hard questions, there was something profoundly healing about that, not because it gave me answers, but because it taught me that peace isn't the absence of pain, it's the presence of God in the middle of it. Conviction, when born from truth, doesn't allow you to look away, it doesn't allow you to forget, it becomes the lens through which you see everything else. It shifts your definitions of freedom, of oppression, of resistance, of love. It doesn't ask you to speak for others, it asks you to stand with them, and when you stand long enough in someone else's shoes, when you hear the echo of their prayers in your own breath, something inside you begins to speak a different language, a language that no longer fits into old frameworks, a language of spirit, of solidarity, of submission to something higher than the systems of this world.